So I wanted to make a video of my thoughts on why I think the R6 is superior to any other 600cc sport bike. And bear with me because I'm going to also point out some of the flaws that the R6 has. And I guess I can start out with that. First of all, this should have, I think every sport bike should have a gas gauge, you know, like the CBR has. That's one thing that they should come with. Second thing that the R6 should have, and it doesn't, is a steering stabilizer. And that's probably even more important than a gas gauge. So that's one of the first things. Like if you do any sort of riding besides babying it, get a bloody steering stabilizer. That will save your life, and all sport bikes should come with that, and the R6 doesn't. But I mean, the GSXRs, they come with one, but it's kind of a crappy one. Like I've seen GSXRs have some nasty tank slappers, some newer ones, and like the OEM ones just aren't that great. The ZXXRs don't come with one. The CBR is probably the best one because it's electronic. So it goes underneath a tank here and it's all electronically dampened. So when you're at low speeds, it doesn't really do much and it's easier to turn the handlebars, and at higher speeds it kicks in and really stabilizes things. CBR rules on steering stabilizers, in my opinion, you know. So, but here's some reasons why I think the R6 is superior to most other 600cc sport bikes. So this is one that I think is pretty well known. I think reliability of the R6 is pretty legendary. I think the only issues these bikes deal with is they need valve adjustments a little sooner than some of the other 600cc's. So I think that's one thing that they struggle with. Specifically in 06 and 07, I think they had a lot more issues. I owned a 2006 R6, and every like 5,000 or 6,000 miles, if you ride it, you know, hard at all, you need a valve adjustment. And that's just unacceptable. With this, with 17K, I did a valve adjustment and it was barely out of spec. And I think that's not terrible on a bike. But like I've seen CBRs go 40,000 miles and they're not terribly out of spec, you know? So I think, yeah, reliability is a huge factor. Second one that a lot of people don't think about and don't realize, but the R6 has an incredible diagnostic system to where you can hold down the select and reset button and then turn on the key, and then you have a diagnostic system that has numerous codes that you can go through, check different electronic systems. You can actuate the exhaust valve. You can turn on the fuel pump. You can do so much. And then if it does throw a code, you can very easily look up that specific code and figure out what the issue is. It has a phenomenal diagnostic system built into the bike, and they've had this since 2006. The CBR is terrible about this. You have a flashing light that signifies specific codes. Now, granted, CBR is one of those that's pretty reliable. I don't think you ever have an issue with that, but like the R6 is like, that's a huge factor that no one really thinks about, that is leaps and bounds beyond any other sport bike. Like every bike should have that, like bare minimum, you know. The ECU should tell you like what's going on, what the issue is, what code comes up. It should be simple. That should, and the thing is, I've never really used it. The only issue I've had, and I've seen this on other R6s, is these exhaust valve, the actuator up in here kind of gives out after some time. But do you need that? No. You can literally unplug it and run it without it, and that's like, you don't need that on this bike. It's just an extra feature mainly for emissions and sound regulations. But yeah, that is a huge feature on this that a lot of people don't realize or even have to use, because this bike is pretty reliable. Another huge factor is they were the first in 2006 that used fully electronic throttle control. Now, this takes some getting used to, and I think some people will say, no, I don't like this, but I think in reality, if you look at any vehicle on the street today, everyone uses electronically controlled throttle, like cars, trucks, and then bikes like GSXR, Kawasaki. They've all gone to this because it's superior. You can, you know, it's just superior. You can control the throttle input a lot more linearly. And then when you're riding the bike, everything is just smoother. I won't get into the details, but it's just the best. Like all bikes are going to that nowadays. And the R6 had that since 2006. Kawasaki ZX6R didn't have that until I believe 2019 or 2020. That's crazy. 2019 or 2020. R6 did it in 2006. You have an extremely it's not just like, oh, it's better. Like, you can feel it. If you jump on a 2006 ZX6R, CBR, any of the others, the R6 has an extremely crisp and precise throttle. And I think the 2006 and 2007 had a extremely slight delay in it, but once you get used to it, it's superior because it's so much more smooth, you know. And the 08, you can't even tell it's there, in my opinion. But that's a huge feature that R6 has been doing for forever. Second thing, 2008, they started using variable intake runners. And so there's these 4 intake runners in here that drop down at specific RPMs. They were using this on MotoGP bikes for Yamaha, like I believe in like 05, 06, and the R1 was the first to get it. And then the 2008 R6 got that feature. And boy, can I tell you, I had an 06 that didn't have that. It makes a world of difference. When you're riding it, you can tell when it drops down, and when it's crazy. Like, the power that it gains from just that is very, very impressive. And it's impressive that Yamaha did this in 2008, and GSXR, Kawasaki, Honda still to this day do not have that feature on their 600cc bikes. And that, you know, offers multiple horsepower throughout the entire RPM range by controlling that. And the R6 was like the only one who's done that. Like, that's incredible. That's technology from leader bikes that they're using on their the 600cc's. That's really impressive. I think another thing that people don't really think about and realize is the quality of the fairings. How well do they stay on the bike when you're going 160? Have you ever had an issue with your fairings falling off? And I can tell you firsthand experience how many GSXRs and CBRs that I've seen with fairings falling off, not holding on, not very structurally sound. I think in 2013, the GSXRs have a lot better fairing design. They have a phenomenal fairing design, very simple to remove, easy to get to stuff. CBRs for a long time struggled with that. And I was surprised myself, but since the 2006 and 2007 fairing design on the R6 is phenomenal. Never had one issue with them falling off. Very sound, very tight. Now, granted, I did have OEM fairings on that bike and this one. I don't know if that makes a huge difference, but I mean, I've never had one issue with fairings popping off or a bolt falling out or a pin coming off or one of the pieces loose. Not one issue. And I had a GSXR 600 that had a ton of issues with that. My friend had an 08 CBR. His fairings they're just a crappy, cheap design, and they keep falling off, and you have to always zip tie and go the extra mile to make sure they're secure. I've never had one issue with the R6. That's another big one that, like, you shouldn't have to worry about your fairings falling off in your bike. And if everything is tight and where it needs to be on the R6, you won't have any issues, and that's huge. Another major downfall that a lot of people don't think about the R6 is the gas tank. Now, you're probably like, what's wrong with the gas tank? Well, you see how far this thing sticks out? Now, if you never crash, you never have to worry about it. In fact, it's a little easier to put your legs in grip when you're leaning the bike. So in some ways, it's a good gas tank, but I would much rather have this further tucked in and this plastic shroud be further over than to have this piece of metal. Because if you go down hard and this hits asphalt and gas gets in there, you are having a massive fire and potentially even exploding your bike. That's one thing that a lot of race R6s, you'll see them have a carbon fiber piece right here, or people will dent these in so that doesn't happen. A small thing, but kind of a big deal, actually. So in my time, I've worked on a lot of bikes, and one thing I think is another big benefit of the R6 is that it's relatively easy to work on. I think the easier bikes to work on is probably the GSXRs. I've had a lot of good luck with those. They're pretty straightforward to get into, change the spark plugs. I know the 06, 07 R6s, they have this piece of the frame that goes right in front of the air box. That makes it pretty difficult to get to the spark plugs, but in 2008, they took that out. So GSXRs are probably a little easier to work on them, but second to that I think is the R6. I worked on CBRs, definitely more difficult to get into under the tank, to do your spark plugs, to do a valve adjustment, to take off the fairings. ZXXRs, same party. I think like 2012 and up, they're a lot. It just take more time to get to where you need to. The fairings coming off. I have a friend of mine who's done some work on his, and it's a pain to get the parts off and to work on his ZXXR. Not a huge deal, but the R6 is pretty straightforward. There's nothing where you have to have like extremely special tools or it's extremely hard to get to. It's all pretty straightforward. I've done multiple valve adjustments that require you to remove the tank and get really deep into the bike, and they weren't extremely difficult. Now I haven't replaced fairings on this bike. I would imagine that's a little tougher, but yeah, pretty easy to work on the R6 if you ever need to, like for spark plugs, air filter, that sort of stuff. So another small thing that may not be applicable to all audiences, but I love to have inverse shifting on my bike. And on the R6, it's pretty straightforward to do that. Now, you do have to cut into the fairings just a little bit on the 06 and up to swap that around. So you do have to get a drill and cut a hole right there to make sure that fits. But besides that, it's just one bolt. You switch it around and it feels great. You don't really have to adjust anything in my experience. And I know on the CBRs, and I believe the ZXXRs, they have a little more trouble getting that to work. I think the GSXRs are pretty straightforward in that regard as well. But a small thing that I would like to point out that I think is another small benefit. Another small thing that sucks about the R6, but it's kind of small and it's not a huge deal, is this doesn't have an oil sight glass. It has a dipstick. Who the frick uses a dipstick? Now, if you could prove to me that a sight glass weighs more or that it's harder to incorporate in the engine design, which it maybe is. Maybe Yamaha designed this because they knew, hey, we can design a better engine and it be lighter if we don't have a sight glass. Because granted, you know, that little dipstick is extremely light, and I could imagine that a sight glass is a little tougher to incorporate. But that sucks. You have to get your bike level, and you almost have to have a stand to get it level and then check your oil. So that's a small thing. That's not a huge deal, but you know, GSXR, Kawasaki, CBR, they have a sight glass. The R6, it kind of sucks that it doesn't have a sight glass to check your oil. Another downfall of the R6 is it is not the most comfortable bike. And I think that's pretty well known for the R6. It's just aggressive. The seating position is not the best. I will say though, I have my shock adjusted to the second lowest setting and stock. These forks, it's probably difficult to tell, but these are actually about 3 or 4 millimeters further up stock. So when I did my fork seals, I lowered those back down to the very, this is not stock. So it does feel a little less aggressive on this R6, but I think CBRs I've ridden are a lot more comfortable. GSXRs as well, a lot more comfortable. Just easier riding position. You could ride longer on them. It's just less stress on your body. Personally, when I've ridden ZXXRs, I feel like they're almost as aggressive as the R6 in my opinion. But I haven't ridden tons of them. I've only ridden like a 2018, 2020, and a 2006 one. So that's not like all of them, but I think that lumps together similar, designs. But yeah, another downfall of the R6. The small thing is the mirrors. Now a lot of people will say, and I'll be the first to admit, that these mirrors don't really look very good on this bike. They're very simple. They kind of just make it look a little dinky. Not the best looking mirrors. Definitely the 2017 R6s have way better looking mirrors. But I will say, for practicality, I love these mirrors. On the 2006 and 7, they had a design where they bolted on right here instead of on the side. These are way better. And the reason being is you can very quickly, just like the GSXR, fold them out of the way in case you need to pass some traffic or you're in a tight space. These are great mirrors. I've never had them loosen. Now, granted, they're OEM, but good mirrors, like practicality wise, excellent mirrors, good visibility. And I definitely have had some issues with the CBR and ZXXRs not being as good, but these are solid mirrors on the R6. This muffler design is definitely tight. It's close to the bike. but there's a portion of it that I don't like. I wish this would stick out another foot and be up here for a few reasons. One is I think the more flow you have through the exhaust, a little more power, because you have more scavenging on effect, and that kind of sucks things out and lets the engine breathe a little bit better. I guarantee you on a dyno, if you had the muffler that extended all the way out with a good flowing exhaust, it would have a little more power than one without. And it's a small thing, but another reason to point that out is like if you have any sort of aftermarket exhaust, you know it's loud, and after a while it kind of hurts your ears. So it'd be nice if this was further out and it had like a little bracket right here and the end of the exhaust was right here. That would be a lot better. I think that Kropovich actually has one that extends further out and ends somewhere up here. But I wish the R6 had that, like the R1. It's a small thing, and there are benefits because it is a little bit lighter and it's closer to the bike, but it's something I wish the R6 had. One thing that also sucks about this bike, the windscreen stock is almost useless. It goes further down. When you tuck behind it, it's almost useless. It's just terrible. I know on the GSXR and on the CBR, they're a little bit better stock. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but I do have an aftermarket that I've cracked several times, an aftermarket windscreen, and this windscreen is phenomenal. You don't really notice it. This comes up several more inches, and when you're tucked behind this one, it's way better. You don't notice it. So it's a small and easy fix. Comparable to this though, I think the ZX6R, the entire front section and the nose, is further down than the R6, and they have the same issue, if not worse, on the ZX6R. So I would say the R6 is probably better in that aspect compared to the ZX6R, but the GSXR is a lot better, and the CBR as well. It's actually functional, and if you add an aftermarket windscreen on the GSXR or the CBR, it really makes a big difference. One of the last things I would like to point out is I love the looks of the ZX6R. I love the looks of the GSXR. I love the looks of the CBR 600. Those all look great. Different models in different years look better than others. I'm not a big fan of the newer ZX6Rs, the 2020s and up, I believe. But there's something about the R6 that I've just always loved. They just look extremely aggressive, wicked. The tail, just everything about them looks phenomenal, except for the mirrors. But yeah, that's one benefit, I think. The R6 just looks absolutely killer. One last thing I wanted to point out about this bike is the gas mileage. Now, I know a lot of people don't get this bike for the gas mileage, but some people get motorcycles for a little better gas mileage. And I wanted to point out that I feel like the R6 isn't the best. I've consistently gotten 38 to 42 miles per gallon on the highway, just cruising at 60, 65 miles an hour. But as soon as you go 75 or give it some throttle here and there, man, this thing seems to use a little more gas than other brands. My friend has a 2008 CBR 600, and consistently he can get 140, 180 miles on one tank. And they're roughly about the same size, but I do think the R6 just uses a little more gas. That's not a terrible thing, but like consistently on this bike, even if I'm pretty gentle with it, my gas light comes on around 110, 120 miles. And then I am bone dry after about another 30 miles. And that's not the best. Just be able to go about 150 miles and be out of gas, that's not that much. I've seen CBRs get a good amount better. I think that's the same with the GSXRs, and I'm not so sure about the ZXXRs. I could see those getting around the same, but it's a small thing, but I wanted to point that out in my experience.